I'm just going to be up here for, but I'd like to use the time to invite up our next panel. And it's my pleasure. First of all, I want to thank Bob for telling us about these exciting plans. I was a little slow because I was taking notes on what we could do for our team and our staff. But I think the Learning Lab is a great innovation. So we talked a lot about new things before, and blockchain was certainly one of those. So this next panel is all about blockchain, its promising, controversial, and sometimes misunderstood notions, and what it's going to do to change the world we all work in. So my guru on blockchain, my go-to person, is Tamika Tilleman, who's been one of the early thought leaders in this area, and he'll be joined by industry leaders Sandra Rowe and Josh Clayman. And first of all, why don't we welcome them all to the stage? And while they're coming up here, let me just tell you about Tamika, and then he in turn will introduce the other panelists. So Tamika wears a lot of hats, but two on blockchain. He's the co-founder and director of the Blockchain Trust Accelerator for the New America Foundation. And he also is the chair for the Blockchain Business Council. Tamika is somebody I've known for many years and has my deepest respect because I know when he takes something on, it's done well and done thoroughly. And so when I heard he was involved in blockchain, I knew it was going to be serious and I had to learn more. And so he had an introduction to blockchain at Davos about 2 years ago, I guess. And it was supposed to be this small dinner. And there was a line out the door, and they kept finding tables and chairs to bring more people in. And then you could just see the level of interest, even though not everybody even knew what blockchain was. And so I hope we'll be in the same situation here, although we all have our chairs and our place to sit. But hang on to your hats, and we'll all learn something very interesting as we go along. So, Tamika.
Thank you so much, Marjorie. Well, it is a pleasure to be here with all of you, and especially a pleasure for me to be here with Marjorie, who has really personified what it means to be a great communicator for the many, many years that we've known each other. So I'm grateful for the opportunity and very grateful to have two extraordinary panelists with us as well. Sandra Rowe, who is the COO of UN Corp and also the recently elected CEO of the Global Blockchain Business Council, and Josh Clayman, who heads the legal working group for the Wall Street Blockchain Alliance. I want to start, before we get into the details of the technology, by just asking a quick series of questions, if I can, of all of you. How many of you, prior to arriving at today's session, had heard the term blockchain? Hopefully most of you. All right, we're doing all right.
Yes.
How many of you have feel like you could explain blockchain to your neighbor over the backyard fence? A few hands, not as many, a few hands. How many of you have actually used blockchain in some form? Very few hands. How many of your companies or organizations are using blockchain or considering using blockchain? More hands. All right. So we have our work cut out for us, but this is going to be a fantastic conversation. Blockchain at its core is a record, and records are certainly nothing new. Humanity has been playing with records in various forms since the time of the Sumerians about 5,500 years ago. But it combines two attributes that enable us to do things that we have never been able to do previously. The first is that it is distributed. What does that mean? Blockchains are maintained on thousands of computers around the world simultaneously, in the case of public blockchains. All of these computers store a copy of the record, and they're all constantly checking each other to ensure the accuracy of the record and the validity of the information that is entered into the record. This is a big deal because it ensures that information that is recorded is supposed to be recorded, and once information is entered into the record, and this takes us to the second big thing you need to remember about blockchain technology, it is permanent. You can update the information, but you cannot erase it. Each new block of data is chained, hence the name, into a system that means you cannot change anything in that record without changing everything in the record. And again, because all of these computers are checking each other, that isn't going to happen. What it means, practically speaking, is that you have a system that is extremely secure, it's extremely transparent, it encourages very high levels of accountability and transparency, and beyond that, it is a mechanism for creating trust in environments where individuals may not trust each other. That's a big deal and something that is going to matter a lot to communicators. I think Marjorie is going to do a Hail Mary. I was waiting for your...
I was going to come around the other way and be discreet, but since you...
I thought you were going to give me an overarm pass and was looking forward to catching it. But what that means, again, for practical purposes, is that this is a new tool, a new mechanism for codifying trust. That is something that is going to matter to a lot of industries. It's especially going to matter to communicators. And I want to start by spending a couple of minutes talking through the technology with Sandra and Josh. And then after that, we're hoping to pivot to a conversation of how this is going to affect the work that you do every day. And then we'll look at some specific use cases and applications that have big potential for communicators in the blockchain space. So Sandra, starting with you, you have an extraordinary background in financial services. And I was in conversation a few days ago with the head of strategy at one of the largest financial institutions in the world. And he told me that the most important thing they were getting out of blockchain is that it was forcing them to revisit all of their assumptions around how their institutions operated. Can you tell us a little bit about why that would be and how this is going to change the game in that sector? And then we'll go from there into a discussion of how it will change the game in other sectors.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. For those who may not know me, and that's most of you in the room, my background comes from being a derivatives banker on the trading floors of Deutsche Bank and Morgan Stanley in London. And then I moved over to CME Group, which is the Chicago Mercantile Exchange Group, 6-7 years ago, actually, and ran their FX and metals research and product development, and eventually their digitization blockchain arm. So my experience really stems from a trading perspective in the traditional markets as well now, looking at digital assets and crypto and blockchain. And I absolutely agree that the statement that your strategist at BNY Mellon stated, which is there's been a complete rethink in many categories, not all categories, but in many areas of post-trade in particular for the banks and the custodians and the asset managers and anyone in the financial ecosystem. And there's also been a rethink that's now percolating to the front end of financial services, which ultimately then touches consumers regarding payments, regarding record keeping, regarding the way content is delivered even to the end user. Let me break it down to two buckets. So I call it the front end and then the back end, simply put. The back end is actually the most interesting from a bank standpoint, for example, or a clearinghouse standpoint, because there are a lot of inefficiencies. A lot of people doing reconciliation around, did this trade happen? And do both sides agree that this trade happened with these details? You would think pretty simple stuff. Well, multiply that by millions of transactions and trillions of dollars worth of transactions. All of a sudden, every single small mistake that might be 0.01 of a decimal point actually matters. And you could have millions of dollars of losses because you don't get that stuff right. And that is why we've got armies of people sitting in back office doing these functions, because actually they're quite critical. And yes, there are mistakes every day, or just conflict, right? Just that things don't reconcile properly because somebody keyed in something wrong or they just don't agree. So long story short, that's sort of the obvious low-hanging fruit for blockchain, meaning if you were able to record transactions in a way that are basically agreed up front and then reconciled, and you don't need the reconciliation, actually, it's already confirmed, you're done, you're good. And you actually could take a lot of people stuff out of this. And that's really the whole process. The thought process is how could you take things that can be automated and can you make them automated in a way that you kind of human-proof certain things? Doesn't mean humans go away. You actually need humans for a lot of functions still. Front end. Front end is where I think is the most interesting piece that's now coming into play, which are opportunities for financial services, which are how do you deliver better customer experience? How do you deliver content and data in a way that's more secure? And these things are just beginning to occur, which is things like smart contracts, which we can talk about later. But these applications are now things that you could build on top of blockchains, which can actually be more efficient. We can get into more details, but I think Josh also has some thoughts on this and also has a disclaimer I think you've got.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
My disclaimer is nothing I say is legal advice, nothing is investment advice, nothing's on behalf of the Wall Street Blockchain Alliance. I also, by the way, co-chair the Blockchain and Smart Contracts group at Morrison and Forrester, but nothing I say is on behalf of them either, so just forget that you
Spoken like a true attorney.
Yes. So now that we're all
Josh
friends.
consulted with her communications professionals prior to.
Exactly. So I think one thing that Sandra said, or many things that Sandra said, are very true. And one point that I'd just like to raise, just more broadly across industries, is this idea of revisiting and re-examining our assumptions about things. So many people say, what is so exciting about this database? Why is everyone changing the world over a database? Why is this a big deal? We have databases. But the thing is, it's bigger than the database. It's not just about the database. In many senses, it seems as though there is a movement towards decentralization generally and to re-examining, as Sandra was saying, the relationships between different parties. So maybe flattening certain hierarchies, maybe removing certain intermediaries, maybe taking back things that, as individuals, that we might normally have entrusted to others. So I think, there are myriad use cases or potential use cases, some better than others, but a lot of this is a re-examination of relationships generally.
So let's build on this a little bit because I think it's a crucial point. I'm a big fan of the historian Yuval Harari, and many of you will be familiar with his work, but he asks a very fundamental question, which is why do human beings run the world? Why are we in charge? In principle, it could be jellyfish, it could be orangutans. There's no reason why we are the ones that do what we do. And he surveys the landscape and eventually comes up with two answers to this question. The first thing that we can do is we can cooperate flexibly. But there are other species that can cooperate flexibly. You've got dolphins and wolves that also have figured out how to do that. But the second thing we do is we cooperate at scale. And yet there are other species like bees or ants that are able to cooperate at scale. We're the only species that combines those two to cooperate flexibly at scale. And the way we do it, and this is where I think it goes to the points that you were making, is we come to agreement around a certain set of facts. And once we have those facts in place, once we have established that base layer of reality, we are able to go off and do amazing things. We can collaborate, we can exchange, we can build, all because we have a common understanding of a certain set of fundamentals that we know to be true. Historically, humanity has relied on institutions to maintain those facts. We have had governments, we have had financial institutions, we've had companies that have been responsible for serving as the custodians of the information that makes up that base layer of reality. The reason that blockchain is intriguing to me, and I think intriguing to a lot of people, is it provides a new mechanism for validating the information that makes up that base layer of reality. It provides a new mechanism for establishing the trust that all of us need in those facts in order to go out and start a company, in order to go out and exchange commercially, or to establish the validity of information. And this is, I think, one of the most crucial aspects of the technology for communicators. And Sandra, I'm going to ask you for help on this. The same technology that can be used and is being used now to validate bank transactions potentially has very significant implications when we're trying to push back against false information, or to use the current, although I loathe it, buzzword of the day, fake news. What does it mean to have a mechanism, a global independent vehicle that allows us to effectively notarize information as it appears?
Yeah, it's no coincidence that blockchain and a lot of this discussion and rethink happened post-financial crisis, right? Bitcoin was launched, the protocol was launched publicly in January of 2009. The white paper came out in November of 2008. That's the first instance of this, where they took cryptography that had been around for decades, married that with a couple other concepts that had been around from an economic standpoint, and brought that together under what we now know as the Bitcoin protocol. So when you think about that rethink, it's no surprise that it was during the post-financial crisis fallout. But where I actually think we need to take a look at is the nature of data, and that was alluded to by the Learning Labs as a major session that will be happening, which is data is not yesterday's data, meaning it is not just information now. That data of the future, and actually it's evolving right now as we speak, actually has value. So it becomes money. In a world where data is information and money, what happens? A lot of stuff starts happening. And in tomorrow's world, who are the winners of data? Well, I put them in 3 categories, and I'll go back to answering your question in properly, but the source of the data, meaning your data is unique, you're the owner of that data, you have power and influence. You're the distributor of the data, you are the pipes. The most pervasive pipes around the world who do it efficiently will win. And then the third category is a much broader category, which is data analytics. The people who run the analytics to be able to define the gems amongst all of the junk that's going to be out there, they're going to win too. And then there's a fourth category I've only recently added to my sort of thesis around breaking up all the data players, is people who create value out of the data. So meaning, either you digitize something that's physical, let's say there's a use case where in real estate, what if you could digitize your ownership of your house and you could liquidate half of it, meaning you could sell fractional ownership of your house, 50%, but you still own the other 50%. Can you do that today legally? No, I don't think you can. Maybe you can. I guess there's timeshares. But it's hard to do. But what if you could do that really easily? What happens to the nature of ownership of things? What if you digitized financial contracts? And there's a number of different elements that could happen. And this is where then information and data is value. And this is where the token and crypto element comes in, which is why I think actually people care so much about blockchain. It's not necessarily the data efficiencies from saving money for processes. It's actually, I think people are beginning to realize all of a sudden now things are going to be digital money. And I think that's the piece that really kind of captivates people's attention. I don't blame people for being captivated by that, but I think we also have to have a serious rethink about what that means, who owns that, who controls that, who doesn't control that. And I think this is where we are today with various tokens, crypto, whether governments are going to digitize their money, et cetera, debate.
So let's spend a moment on this because I think it's crucial for this audience to understand the idea of tokenization and how tokenization relates to blockchain. We have this record. The record keeps track of whatever we want it to keep track of, but one of the most fundamental things that it keeps track of is who owns what. And we use that for digital currencies and in the first incarnations of blockchain around Bitcoin and Ethereum and other digital currencies. It's a ledger, and it keeps track of how many Bitcoin I have, how many Bitcoin you have, and any transactions that exist between the two of us. But what people recognize pretty quickly is once you can tokenize currency, you can also tokenize anything. You can assign value to, as you were saying, a house or a car or a piece of equipment. The opportunities are pretty limitless. And that same principle, again, applies to content that communicators are creating and a lot of the companies here are creating. Are we seeing new attempts to take content and register it on blockchain and use blockchain as the mechanism for assigning ownership and moving that content around among different stakeholders?
The short answer is yes, it's happening across industries. But I mean, Josh, from a legal standpoint, it does pose challenges, no?
It does. Before I jump in, I guess, to some legal points, although not legal advice still, definitely, if you think about like the music industry or other industries where you may have royalties, right? Those are sort of natural, some say, places where you might want to have something on a blockchain, and then be able to separate out the various types of ownership and the various types of permissions. So there's a lot of flexibility. I guess I can talk a little bit about some of the challenges with respect to regulations, but I also, it might be helpful for a second, unless this has already been done separately, just to sort of describe what a digital token is.
Please.
Because when I hear tokenization, I don't know about you guys, but I somehow think about things like turning into a coin, and that's not what happens, right? If you think of a digital token and you don't think of a coin or a Chuck E. Cheese token, something like that, or a video game arcade, right? If you think instead of a string of numbers, just like your credit card number or any other series of numbers, and you think about it that way, it really helps to really describe why there are so many different types of tokens and why some of the rules and the laws around the tokens may be less than clear at times. Because you could say things, I'll give a few examples. When you bring home a big box software, right? The first thing you do when you're installing it, if I recall correctly, is you put in a key, right? A key code. Okay, so that could be a token, right? If I am having tokens and I want to offer them and sell them and say this is a license to use my software, you can see how that string of numbers might work that way. Similarly, you could have a string of numbers and you could say anyone who's holding one of these numbers is going to get $5 from me, or they're going to get a vote, or any number of things. They're going to be able to belong to Sandra's fan club, things like that. So there's a lot of different ways that you can structure these, and the tokens themselves don't of themselves have any characteristics other than that they're numbers until you ascribe them to them. So when we talk about tokenizing assets, it's not that the condo becomes somehow a coin, right, or a token. It's that the number, the string of numbers, or however you want to describe it, on the digital distributed ledger is going to represent, and we're going to agree that it represents, a condo or something like that. So I think I just want to mention that for a moment.
Well, I think that's a really crucial point. And again, as we talk through some of the applications for blockchain technology, once we have this architecture in place, you can use it in a wide variety of different applications. So there are companies in this room that are using blockchain in their supply chain. Mm-hmm. Why would you need blockchain in your supply chain? And Sandra, I don't know whether you can speak to that for us.
Yeah, so for anyone who thinks that blockchain is just for the financial services industry, that is absolutely not the case. It is now permeating across government processes, healthcare, energy. You were just at a major energy conference. It's literally pervasive. It's anywhere that you think, or a group of people think, that a blockchain could be utilized to basically either create trust data or transactions, or improve security. It's actually usually all of the above, all the benefits that were just listed up on this screen. And it helps to streamline processes that can be automated, as I mentioned before. So when I think of use cases that are outside of financial services, supply chain is a classic one. And UN Corp, which is a company you probably never heard of because it's a startup, just co-founded it a number of months ago with a colleague who's an MIT entrepreneur in residence. And we're focusing on a blockchain for social good project, which is how can we help rural farmers sitting mainly in developing nations with price transparency and the ability to negotiate better physical commodities pricing. And here's why, and this is the important part, which is you'd be shocked, some people are shocked to know that in $10 of value of a supply chain in physical commodities, how much do you think the farmer is actually getting? There's a lot of leakage in the middle. There's a lot of opacity for a reason, because all those people in the middle, they like to take advantage of that. And that's what's happening today, pretty much across every physical commodity you can think of. And that finished product that the big buyers buy, they pay the $10 of value, but at the end of the day, maybe the farmer's getting $1 or less. What we're trying to say is, look, with blockchain, let's improve that supply chain transparency element, where maybe perhaps one day we could have $2 go into the pockets of the farmer, and we're not going to change the $10 necessarily. That means a lot to the person who sits on that source side of the supply chain. And that's just one example of many others. There's a wonderful company called Chronicled who's working on IoT plus smart contracts plus blockchain in the pharmaceutical industry. They've got a number of different projects they're working on, but the one that I like the best, I like to talk about, is they have these stickers, and the stickers have a temperature range, and there are certain vaccinations in the world that get sent to Africa or to other developing nations where the efficacy literally goes to 0 if it goes out of the temperature range. Well, guess what? A lot of vaccinations, you have no idea where it's gone from point A to point B to point C, whether it's actually gone out of the temperature range. And therefore, when it gets to point C, the efficacy is gone, so you might as well not administer it because the whole box is just deteriorated. Imagine a sticker that could then alert you if that's happened. That's possible. So there's a real-world application.
So let's take this concept now and apply it to information. I was invited a few weeks ago to go out and meet with the senior leadership of one of the world's largest social networks. And they're facing a big challenge, which will not be news to anybody in this room, of bad information percolating through their systems. And their question is very similar to Sandra's vaccine example. They need to be able to track information as it moves through the system. They need a supply chain for information, which is something that really doesn't exist on the internet right now. Josh, help us think this through. How can blockchain be used to harness the challenges facing communicators right now as they try to ensure that accurate information reaches their stakeholders?
Well, I guess if I draw a parallel to say you want to know where your favorite champagne is from. You think it's from the Champagne region of France because it's called Champagne, but is that really where it came from, right? With blockchain and the ability to track, as Sandra said, you can actually determine where something came from and the entire chain of title along the way. So if you could do that with information and you could somehow know where it initially was input and each place it may have changed along the way, then you can maybe unpack a little bit of the whisper down the lane that we might have and that we might experience in real life. And I think maybe, I know, Sandra, you mentioned smart contracts. Should we describe those for a moment? Okay, so it's really great that we have this database, if we just want to call it that for a moment, where we have data input, okay? But what do you do with that once it's in there, other than having a so-called, we'll say, immutable record? Well, one thing you can do is you can have a smart contract, and that sounds very fancy and it sounds very smart, but really, at the end of the day, it's a computer code. Right? It may or may not be enforceable. We have years and years of corporate law to determine whether it is in fact a contract, but it's computer code. You may have a natural language component that goes along with it, which we can talk about, I guess, a little bit later. But I'll give 2 examples of smart contracts. One is having nothing really to do with blockchain, but it's just a classic example that's given, which is the idea of a vending machine. So if you put in $1, whatever it's up to these days, and you press the button, if the machine is working, you'll get your bag of chips. You don't need us to collect the money. Yep, it's there. Now I'm going to give you the bag of chips. It just happens if it's working properly. So that's the idea behind a smart contract. It uses if-then logic to cause the happening of something upon the happening of another thing. Another example might be, I think sometimes it's described as travel insurance. So what if there was a way that you could have, as soon as the passenger manifesto, or manifest, whatever it's called, for your flight determines that you're not there, you automatically get a payout, right? If you could have something like that, just automating, self-executing contracts, there's a lot of stuff you can do with data in the blockchain. Now you may say, well, but the fact that I'm not on the plane, that's not going to be in the blockchain or in a blockchain. And you're right, and that is why you would go to an outside source. And if you ever hear descriptions called data oracles, that's really what that is. A data oracle is something outside of the blockchain that the parties to a smart contract have determined can be trusted and will give data so that you know whether the if has occurred. That could be a certain interest rate, that could be the score of a game, that could be whether you're on the flight. That's just some terminology.
So you're raising another really critical challenge for communicators here, Josh, which is that Many of the organizations in this room are already experimenting with blockchain solutions. Many more are going to deploy blockchain solutions in the course of coming years. At the moment, there is an entirely new vocabulary that exists around these technologies. And frankly, the people who came up with these terms did not consult any of the folks in this room when they were doing so.
Exactly.
And this creates a bunch of big challenges, going back, frankly, to square one. I mean, if you want a really lousy term with a lot of bad imagery, blocks and chains, it's not really where you would pick up if you are looking for a technology that's going to promote accountability and transparency. So, for both of you, what do the communicators in this room need to do in order to get ahead of that? And frankly, the other side of this is, how can they help this new field shape a vocabulary and a lexicon that is going to make sense to people? Because, again, cryptographers and the other brilliant coders who have been responsible for a lot of the evolution that's occurred to date have done extraordinary things at a technical level. I think when it comes to the accomplishments that we've seen in the last few years, in a raw technical sense, they are giants. But as communicators, I think it's fair to say many of them are pygmies. And so how do we reconcile this fact and come to a better understanding of the language that needs to be used to tell the story of how these technologies will solve problems?
I'll start. We need help, like now.
The first step is admitting you have a problem.
Badly. You're absolutely right. And the community itself has accepted the fact that they've really messed it up from a communication standpoint because they weren't thinking about it. And so now, all of a sudden, you see things splashed across the screens and on Twitter and whatnot, and it's just a jumbled mess. There's small groups trying to find common taxonomy. And part of it also, I don't cast all the blame on the community. It's not like we're all bad at this. It's just things are developing so quickly that terminology is also evolving very quickly, which is just natural course of the way things happen. I think we will get to a place where we will have some common taxonomy, but we're not quite there yet. Some people use blockchain as an umbrella term for anything related to a distributed database. Other people, cringe at that and freak out whenever you say anything like that. So we still have a lot to do, but I think what would be really helpful is that if we had communications experts and leaders stepping into this space and actually providing some leadership in that way. You would not believe how many companies I get approached all the time saying, do you know anyone who's really good at communications? Do you know anyone who actually we could hire? There is a lot of opportunity right now. I think there's opportunity for firms to be created to step into this space to help out all of the startups that just have no clue with respect to proper communication and storytelling. The storytelling element is what we're really missing. And I'm not talking about the stories about, Bitcoin, bro culture, and whatever. I'm talking about storytelling in a way that the average person will begin to understand why this will have benefits to, their lives. And there's going to be many areas. So for me, this is opportunity. I implore all of you to try to help us in your own space, whatever it is. And, it's a major deficit for the community right now.
Josh, I think the other piece of this is, just as there are significant deficits and gaps that exist around the communications side of the story on blockchain technology, there are also big gaps that exist on the regulatory side of the house. And eventually, those gaps become the problems of communicators who are responsible for explaining those challenges when companies and other organizations encounter them. We're in a space right now where many of the regulators don't know what to make of this yet. They don't know how to apply these entirely new tools and frameworks to existing bodies of law and rulemaking. Tell us a little bit about what communicators should be thinking about as they try to help their companies get ahead of this. I mean, one example that I was thinking about this morning is that, as a group, communicators have a pretty established set of tools that they use when people make mistakes and when they need to explain those mistakes to the stakeholders within their organization. We don't really yet have an established set of tools for when distributed autonomous contracts or entities make mistakes. And those mistakes are going to come. And we're going to have to develop a new toolbox to help explore and explain what should happen when that transpires. Any thoughts on that, friend?
So I have a number of thoughts, but if I could chunk them into a few different categories. So what you're mentioning first about regulators, I mean, there are so many crisscrossing regulations because some believe that this is, the idea of, say, a digital token and the way that it's being used potentially is a creation of a new kind of asset. There are different views about what exactly the token is. Certainly the SEC has spoken out a lot saying that, many of these are securities in the US. But the thing I think to remember is it's not just the US. So not only do we have these crisscrossing and sometimes overlapping, not just gaps, but actually overlapping regulations, but by and large, I mean, the token sales that you may have heard of, also called ICOs, they're happening globally. So we have other jurisdictions with, again, sometimes overlapping, sometimes gaps in terms of regulation. And there isn't always, to Sandra's point, a common language, even, across, whether something is likely to be, say, a security in one country versus in another, or even whether security is the same thing.
To unpack this for a moment for this audience, traditionally, if a company wants to raise money, they do an initial public offering. And presumably most of us know what that looks like, and that's a very well-regulated process. For an initial coin offering or an initial token offering, depending.
Again, terrible terminology.
Terrible terminology.
Yes, terrible.
There really isn't any body of information, and can you tell us what this is in a nutshell? What does this process entail?
Sure, and I will say I should say this even though not legal advice, but I feel responsible to say it. There definitely are laws that do apply, and there are laws that need to be followed. So it's not that there was this creation of something entirely new and nothing applies, which sometimes I think has been a confusing message that has been communicated, right? This isn't the Wild West. It never was. There are rules everywhere. You can't help but trip over them. So many people decided to sell digital tokens broadly, okay? They don't always sell them to unaccredited retail, like mom and pop investors. Sometimes they only sell them to particular types of sophisticated accredited investors. But there are different reasons for which they were doing that. In some cases, it was purely to raise money, right? Purely a play for raising money. In other cases, to a greater or lesser extent, they may have been trying to build a network somehow and take advantage of a network effect by having broadly distributed tokens that then could be exchanged, right? So this is a very generic description, so maybe not as helpful, but perhaps helpful as a starting point. There have been many, many stumbles thus far, and a few places that I can think of just off the top of my head where communicators are needed. Okay, if you have companies that are contemplating doing a token sale, they need to have disclosure documents. Whether they're a white paper, whether they're white papers, which are, there's no one form, right, which is in and of itself a challenge, or whether they actually have prospectuses and things like that, depending on how they're done. But you need to be able to know, and this was said by a colleague of mine once, whether the person writing this is a genius or a fool. Like, it has to be clear. You have to know that the regulators are people too, and they have to be able to understand it, and people need to be able to understand it. And beyond just the written messaging, you also have people who sit on panels and talk about things. And they may be communicating, they may not be used to be communicating about things that are likely to be sales of securities in many cases. They may just be founders who are excited about what they think is a software that they're selling or something like that. And so it's really critical because certain things that they may say may have a material impact on whether they have run afoul of a law, even if you're not thinking about any of the regulations that exist, whether securities or otherwise, fraud, you can't do it, right? And so
Good rule.
yeah. So statements about this wonderful technology, and of course we do need, I think one of the slides talked about compelling narratives or something like that in a decentralized space, right? Yes, we need them, but we can't have overstatements, and we can't have people making claims that then others are making investments based on. So those are a couple of things. If I may just say one more thing, and I'll pass the mic, so to speak. Back to smart contracts for a minute. One of the critical things, I think, is that talk for a minute about the natural language versus the code. So how do you know the two match? And that's something we struggle with as lawyers, certainly, because you go to law school, or for all the communicators, the professionals here, you go to school or you somehow train to be sure that you're using the right term, that you're using a term of art. Now, how do you make sure that that makes its way into a smart contract? And part of the solution may be that you keep the smart contracts very simple, just very basic, and you still keep your natural language contract for your indemnities and all sorts of other things. But I think that's a key element. And for people who may be able to span both worlds, meaning they are communications professionals and they happen to be able to code, that is important. I think that will be more and more important as we go forward.
So we're going to pivot to the audience's questions in just a moment, so start thinking of those questions now. But before we do that, I wanted to talk through a couple of specific use cases. Both of you mentioned a number of companies or strategies that are evolving to harness these technologies to solve problems. And we're seeing some intriguing early efforts to address challenges facing communicators or the media, and wanted to spend just a moment on those. The first is a new startup called Civil that I think some of us have dealt with. They're building a blockchain-based newsroom that will allow any organization, and in most instances these are media organizations or organizations that generate content, to create a news platform where they'll be able to sell their content directly to consumers, and do so in a way that really isn't possible today. If you think about the subscription model for media, the reason that media organizations exist the way they do right now is because transaction fees are so high that it's impossible for them to sell, in most instances, a single story profitably. There's no way for me to go to a newspaper website and pay 10 cents to read a story in a way that is financially viable for the organization on the other side of that transaction. With blockchain technology, your transaction costs should come down precipitously, and you will be able to enable micropayments that will allow individuals to consume news on an entirely new basis. We'll be able to pay 10 cents or 5 cents or 1 cent for a story, and if you do that at scale, it's a pretty good deal for all parties involved. So we're seeing with Civil the first real attempt at this, and they're collaborating with a number of different organizations to establish blockchain-based newsrooms. We're also seeing some fascinating efforts to validate information. And here there's another New York-based organization called VoxGov, which is creating initially a registry of government information. So they figured out how to map all of the networks of government organizations. 80% of that information is not available through an internet search. And they take all of that information, scrape it from the sites, and then log it and register it in a way that is very secure and can't be altered down the road. We see every 4 years or 8 years when a new administration comes into power in the United States, there is this vast, bizarre Orwellian process that occurs where information that is not of the liking of the current administration is expunged from the public record, and it's not available to be searched. Once you have information in a secure blockchain-based system, it's going to be there, and you can use it for data visualization and a whole bunch of other things. The last intriguing thing that I'll mention is we're seeing new efforts to validate information that's put out into the public space. One example on this, we do some work with an organization that's one of the largest election monitors in the world. And when they release a report on the validity of election results, it's really important. That information is going to determine whether there are riots in the streets, or it's going to determine whether or not people accept the results of a democratic process. They have already experienced in a number of countries that the information they put out, the press releases that they issue, will be taken and altered in ways that suit the political ends of different actors on the ground, but totally distort the information that they are releasing into the system. And so they're now working to notarize this information via blockchain in order to ensure its accuracy and to ensure that there is a reliable record of information that was released into the public sphere.
Yeah.
Do you have thoughts on
So I
these
just have
cases?
one comment to make about what you've just said, which I think is really important. In a network in the blockchain world, you assume, there's game theory in this, you assume there are bad actors. You cannot prevent the bad actors from doing what they want to do because they're going to be bad actors. What you can do, however, is you can have transparency that finds out who is a bad actor very quickly, and then the network can deal with what to do with that bad actor. In today's world, we have bad actors doing different things, but it's not well organized enough in some cases for us to get the bad actors out or to have them have accountability fast enough before they do lots of damage. So that's one concept that I think if anyone asks you why is blockchain even a topic, it's actually to reduce a lot of fraud and to raise the transparency of things. And voting is one of them. Press releases that get manipulated in the voting process, that's another application. It's pretty important in certain cases, right?
Here I have to do a 30-second commercial. Last week we announced a new partnership to do blockchain-based voting in the state of West Virginia for overseas military voters. So we're seeing some of these solutions already come into place. All right, I'm being told that it is question time. So what I would ask is we will take 3 questions altogether and then give folks an opportunity to respond. Please.
Al Como from Elevate Credit. Thanks for coming today. I'm more scared now than I was before.
Oh, no!
I have an observation. Twice I've been this scared in my life. When I was in high school, I was told that if I didn't understand computer science, I wouldn't be able to make a living pretty soon. And I had to, take this computer science class, and it was coding. But somebody showed me a Mac 5 years later, and suddenly it all was easy. They had figured out how to dumb it down for someone like me. 10 years later, they were showing me HTTP, and you had to type in all this stuff. And then somebody showed me, and I said, this could never work, but then somebody showed me Yahoo. And it all made sense. This is before Google. It all made sense now. I could figure out how to do things. It was all organized for me, etc. So my observation is I have to believe somebody will come along with something that makes it possible for this to be, for the average person to understand. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that and what's going on in that space.
Wonderful question. All right, let's take 2 more, please. Over here.
Hi, Arthur Hodges from CoBank in Denver. This is a great presentation, thanks. I'm curious, since the trust element that blockchain provides is typically now provided by mostly governments, right? That's what money systems are run by governments because you need a government to provide that trust. What is the risk or the potential that governments will be threatened enough by the emergence of blockchain that they'll actually sort of as stakeholders try to shut it down or stop it, if that makes sense? Thank you.
Great question. And right here.
Hi, I'm Jim Finn. 2 observations. First, one, interesting, you didn't at all mention Bitcoin, this is the underlying technology for it.
I think we mentioned it twice, but quickly.
But a lot of people get to it from there. And secondly, Charlie Perkins, another member here, and I had a startup client last year, and they said, one of them said, oh, I don't want to talk to any journalists that you have to explain this to. I said, well, you won't be talking to any then. as we all see, this is not a 30-second elevator pitch.
Yeah.
2 questions. On the technology front, is there a danger of the technology forking like open source when you have groups like Hyperledger that has IBM and SAP and Ethereum that has Microsoft? And secondly, how long will the regulatory process happen around this? Because it seems like it's very early days with everybody announcing pilots, but no real uses yet.
So let's start and take these in reverse order, and maybe Josh, you can help us out both with the regulatory discussion, and then if you want to opine on forking as well, that would be welcome, although we can take that one separately.
So with respect to regulation, I think there's not going to be one point where all regulation magically comes together across the world. I've sat in retreats with regulators from around the world and other colleagues at other firms and entrepreneurs, and we've all tried to put together little tiny pieces, and that's a challenge. But one of the things, if we think not necessarily just about tokens and Bitcoin or digital tokens generally, but if we think about the technology, I think sometimes it's very enticing and attractive to think, okay, we're going to pass enabling legislation for this technology's use, when you might not really have to. So I think rather than just having regulation permitting things, let's hold aside the things prohibiting things, okay? But say the technology itself. For example, if every state came out with different laws saying, now you can use blockchain for this, now you can use blockchain for that, does that mean you can't use the technology for other things? Like, do we do that for every technology? It would seem to be a little bit weird that we could end up with this patchwork and some uncertainty. So some people have provided some kind of recommendations that, you know what, in terms of enabling legislation, if there's not something that actually makes it either impossible or illegal to use the technology within a jurisdiction or has some ambiguity as to whether you could use it, maybe you don't actually need to have enabling legislation. So I think a lot of thoughts, I mean, there's a lot of regulation out there and a lot of different types of laws, so I don't think we can address them all in one way. But I would say, in each case, you kind of have to question whether you actually need new legislation. On the forking point, I think maybe one of you might be better positioned to answer that.
I think if you meant by forking, meaning they're private ledgers kind of controlled by vendors or big institutions versus open source completely open and public like Bitcoin and Ethereum itself proper. These are public blockchains. My view is it's already happening. There is a plethora of blockchains now being created around the world. And look, each one's going to have a specific or does have a specific use case. Just because something is private and it's being used within an organization doesn't mean it doesn't have utility value for that organization. It just might mean that not everyone's going to use it. And it's a reason why it's private and it's walled off, because they only want a certain group of people to use it. Fine. We have intranets and we have got the internet. I mean, these things can coexist. But the real issue right now, from an infrastructure standpoint, is now we know we've got so many blockchains. How the heck are they going to talk to each other? That interoperability question is where I spend a lot of my time right now, because if they don't talk to each other at a certain level, then what was the point of all of this, really? So that's where we are from a technology standpoint. There's also issues around scaling. And by the way, the reason why the private blockchains came up to begin with, or the distributed ledgers that they're sometimes called, is because financial information particularly needs to be private. You cannot have everything out there. And frankly, I don't want my stuff out there like that. I want it secured, but doesn't mean that I want all of you all to know, the last transaction I did, right? So there were some real needs that the public blockchains just were not solving for and have not quite solved for yet. But by the way, the public blockchains are all working on, developers are working on that. There will be solutions coming down the pipe about confidentiality, privacy, and scalability. It's just, I'm not surprised that we've got a whole bunch of private ledgers and blockchains now, because there are different reasons for why people need these things. And let's figure out how they talk to each other.
Well, I think for me a very helpful analog is for those of us who can remember the early days of the internet. At that point, what we saw is a lot of different companies and organizations establishing intranets. And those intranets were designed to facilitate activity or exchange or communication within organizations. And then eventually we reached a point where people recognized, wow, it would be really convenient if we could actually work across organizations as well. And when that occurred, many of those intranets laddered into this new creation called the internet, and the rest is history. I think this also raises some good points around the government question that was asked earlier. What we have found, and I do a great deal of work with governments and spent a lot of time working with governments, is that nowhere is the trust crisis more acute than for governments. While we are seeing a global collapse in confidence, nowhere is that problem more excruciating than for government. We'll try that. Than for government institutions. And so they are keenly aware of the need in this space. If you look at the US government alone, we had a conversation with the Treasury Department recently. They last year issued $144 billion in improper payments. That's billion with a B. They know that the application of blockchain technology would help them dramatically reduce that number. And so while certainly there will be concerns to the extent that this is a new alternative to record keeping by institutions, and there will be, I think, a moment in which many institutions that are run by individuals who are not doing a good job keeping track of information get a little bit nervous about this. On the whole, there are massive gains to be made for government. The last point that I would make goes back to the first question that was asked, and it is that, again, if you think about the story of the internet, we are, if you put it in that context, in 1993, maybe 1994, when it comes to this technology. And this is one of the great communications opportunities in the history of humankind. I would argue that in few instances have you had a technology with so much transformational potential that is so difficult to explain or has been explained as badly. Hopefully not today. But I think, again, there is a massive opportunity for people in this room to help shape that process.
I just want to add, no one needs to be a computer scientist. No one needs to know about coding. Actually, I would argue there's nothing to fear. If anything, see it as an opportunity. Because here's the thing. Blockchain is infrastructure layer technology similar to TCP/IP, which run all of our stuff in the background. I don't know how my mobile phone works. I know I punch a bunch of apps, and if it doesn't work, I get mad. But otherwise, I just expect my apps to run on my mobile phone and the internet to work, right? And so I think this sort of obsession about I got to know everything about blockchain. I think unless you want to become a blockchain professional, no, you really don't. There are so many other skill sets we need in this industry, because ultimately what this is another tech industry that's being built. It needs every skill set we can imagine. And, I think that's one of the key things of why we want to be at, organizations like yours, is to actually say, look, you're professionals with with amazing skill sets in areas that the developers need help. Business practitioners need help in this. This is a growing, potentially multi-billion-dollar, multi-trillion-dollar industry that's growing over the next decade. And for anyone who thinks it's late, no. We're in the ugly duckling phase of this whole tech. Very ugly.
Well, I think on that happy note, Josh, unless you can give us a 5-second summation since we are out of time.
I'll just say this. When I started getting into blockchain, I heard about smart contracts. I heard that they were going to reduce legal spend, and I got scared. So I figured out what the heck is going on. But what I found was there are myriad opportunities, new opportunities for me in which the law interacts. And I think for you guys, to the extent that there may be any fear around blockchain and what it may mean for you, I think in a lot of ways it'll pose a lot of exciting new puzzles that you'll be able to help figure out.
A friend of mine told me that we will know we've succeeded when we stop talking about blockchain. Hopefully those of you in this room can help make that happen. So if we can help you at the Global Blockchain Business Council move that effort forward, we would love to chat. Beyond that, please join me in thanking Josh and Sandra for today's conversation.